Hi, I'm Sam, and welcome to IPR's Game Room. Today we'll be talking about Noirlandia. Noirlandia is a GM-less one-shot role-playing game about solving a murder mystery and the sacrifices you can and will inevitably make in pursuit of answers. Noirlandia requires a decent handful of materials, but they're all pretty easy to access in some way, shape, or form, whether you can find them around your house, online, or purchase them from a store. It requires character and ref sheets, as most games do, as well as a deck of playing cards, excluding the Joker, a dozen or so dice of two separate colors, preferably black and white, but any polarizing set of colors will do. It also requires a board, preferably a cork board, a handful of thumbtacks, string, scissors, and paper. But any sort of board, in all actuality, will do, and this does mean that if you could find a sort of editable medium online, you could play it online with friends. Noirlandia has 5 steps to set up in gameplay. 1. Create the city. 2. Create the characters. 3. Create the victim. 4. Search for answers. And 5. Tell an epilogue. We'll be covering each of these steps step by step throughout this video. Step 1. Creating the city. Each city has its own type of corruption, decided by rolling a d6 or a 6-sided dice. There's a table in the book that tells you what sort of corruption you will land on. You will then talk about how this corruption affects your city, as well as things like where it came from with your players, or everyone else at the table. You'll also answer a few questions about the city, which I'll be covering a little bit later on. Step 1. Creating the city. Each city has its own unique type of corruption, decided by rolling a d6 or a 6-sided die and comparing it to the table in the book. You'll then discuss where this corruption came from and how this corruption affects the city and the gameplay throughout the game. You'll also answer a few other small questions about things such as the architecture or unique language. Each city has 4 districts that will become relevant throughout the narration. Each of the districts is assigned to one of the 4 suits of a deck of cards. Downtown being the heart, Skid Row being the clover, outskirts being the club, and the upper crust being the diamond. After you've finished discussing any sort of significant names or the notable landmarks of the 4 districts, you'll then further discuss the language and eventually assign a name to the city. The second step is the character creation process. This is done by rolling a number of dice equal to the number of players at the table plus 1, and then you draw the same number of cards as the number of dice you rolled. Each card will then have a dice assigned to it randomly. Each card and each dice will dictate different aspects of the characters. The number on the dice will dictate this character's principle, which is something that they stick to strongly and will be extremely relevant throughout the game. The card's value will dictate your character's identity, or what sort of thing it is that they do for a living. And the card suit will assign them to a district, which will basically just be where they live and or work. Each player will pick one of the characters that intrigues them and do the regular things such as assign a name and an appearance, as well as nicknames that might be relevant. After every player has picked a character, you then take the last set of a dice and a card, and that creates your victim. You'll then go around the table dictating your relationship to the victim in private, and if 2 people have the same sort of relationship, such as the example given in the book, 2 people are married to the victim, you'll simply narrate it in the story, such as, for example, the victim got divorced, or perhaps was very successfully cheating on one of their significant others. Once everyone has picked their character, and the victim has been created, as well as everyone's relationships with the victim, you'll then look at the character sheet, and they'll pick one of the 4 conditions: body, mind, heart, or rep. One of the conditions will get a black square, or a black die, which I'll get to later, and the other will get a white square, or a white die. The other 2 will remain neutral, in the dotted out square. After your character sheets have been filled out, and your relationship with the victim has been set, you'll then go around the table introducing your characters and setting relationships with one another. Once everyone's characters are completed and you've all introduced yourselves, you will then go on to learn about the murder. This will consist of drawing 2 cards, and then putting them in the assigned districts based off of their suit. You'll then go around discussing what the cards mean. but one person, the person who drew the card, will have the final say on the matter. If you don't feel like going through the hassle of creating characters in a setting, they do have pre-made settings on their website for this game. Now that we've done the creation process, we're now onto the actual gameplay, or the investigation. The goal of the investigation is to answer 3 questions. Why was the victim killed? How was it pulled off? And who did it? The way that you answer these questions is through going through scenes. Each scene has a main protagonist, which will be one of the players at the table, and everyone else will take the role of a supporter. At the beginning of each scene, the protagonist will answer 3 other questions. Where are you? What are you doing? And who are you with? Supporters will describe the world and the situation based off of the answers of these questions, and the protagonist will roleplay however they wish. But you should remember, this is an active investigation in a corrupt city, so you don't want to roleplay casual things like breakfast. You want to actively roleplay finding answers. And on top of that, you want to roleplay with whatever skill or condition you will have the best chances of success with. At a certain point, you will roll something called a challenge roll, which is when you roll a certain number of white dice, or whatever color of dice you have assigned for the protagonist. If you use your condition that has a white box next to it, you'll add 1 to this roll. And the opposing supporters will roll black dice, or whatever the opposing dice is. And if you are using a condition that you have a black box marked in, you will add that amount of dice to their pool. You'll then compare the dice, and whichever one is higher ends up being a success. If yours is higher by a certain amount, you succeed. If theirs is higher by a certain amount, you lose. And if there's a tie, then the supporters get to offer something called a bargain, which is when they put one of your conditions on the table in order for you to get the outcome that you desire, but at a cost. At a certain point, you, or the protagonist, will roll something called an investigation roll, which is arguably the most important roll of the scene. You will roll 2 white dice, adding 1 if you have a white box marked next to the condition being used. And the supporters will roll 3 black dice, adding 1 if you have a black box marked next to the condition being used. The supporters will also gain white dice depending on if certain criteria are met. These are called bargain dice, and we'll be talking about them in a few minutes. You succeed at these rolls the same way you do with a challenge roll, except in this case there are outcomes for both a hit and a miss, and the supporters will always have a miss because there's 3 dice to 2 dice. Now, if you want and are able to, you can also switch out 1 of the dice that you, the protagonist, roll with 1 of the bargain dice to give you another hit. If any of your dice are tied, then you can do something called breaking your principle, which is when you do something against your principle that was assigned in the character creation process to break the ties. You can only do this twice in a game. Different outcomes of hit and miss will result in different things, such as a hit in 1 will de-escalate something, which we'll be coming to in a second, and a hit of 6 will give you a lead or a connection. You need 3 connections in order to answer a question. We'll be covering that a little bit more as well. Once you've either answered all 3 questions, or had 3 districts escalate, which is to say, failed severely in 3 rolls and caused 3 separate districts to fall into a state of disarray, then you'll go on to something called the epilogue. For the epilogue, each player will take a certain amount of white and black dice, depending on certain aspects of the game and the outcome. And then you'll go around the table, and you'll dictate a fortunately, unfortunately story for each character, ending on something related to the city, such as, did you guys help any part of the city, or did you improve the state in a district, or perhaps you made a state in a district even worse than it was before. And that's Noirlandia, an amazing game. Make sure to check it out in the Indie Press Revolution link below. And while you're down there, make sure to subscribe, and also check out our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as our monthly newsletter. It only comes out once a month, and has a bunch of interesting things that we here at Indie Press Revolutions think that you will enjoy. And remember, gamers, are you really willing to take that bargain? Are you really willing to sacrifice something so important for the sake of answers? What are you willing to bargain? See you all next time!